Did you know that India is now a $3.7 trillion economy? It is already the fifth largest economy in the world. Did you know that it will overtake Germany at the end of 2025 and Japan by 2026? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host Anil Padmanabhan. Last week, the government released the latest data on India's gross domestic product or GDP. The growth rates for the first quarter ended June came in a shade lower than the projected 7%. This prompted headlines that India's economy was slowing down. However, 2 days later, the Reserve Bank of India governor dismissed these claims and argued that India's economic momentum was intact. In other words, its progress towards becoming the third largest economy in the world was secure. To unpack India's economic potential, I spoke to Saugata Bhattacharya. He's an economist, a previous guest on this show, and at present a senior fellow at the Delhi-based think tank Center for Policy Research. I began by asking Saugata what he thought of the Reserve Bank of India governor's remarks.
I think I would agree with the governor that we probably are on course. Our own estimate forecast, still early days, but our forecast is 7% for the full FY25 GDP growth, 7%. So let's break this number down. The first quarter, we got the GDP number correct. But the GVA number, which I think is more suited, is a better measure for economic activity, the gross value added number. That came in much higher. We were expecting a 6.6% GDP growth, GDP. That came in at 6.7. And we are expecting a 5.8% actual GVA growth that came in at 6.8%, a full percentage point higher than our expectations. So the reason that we were expecting a slowdown in GVA was, of course, lower spending by the government, which also has not completely shown up, but to a certain extent it has. We were expecting a little bit of a disruption from the agricultural side. That actually, despite the low number 2%, it actually came in higher than we had expected, because all the heat wave related disruptions, etc. So I'm sure horticulture, other animal husbandry, etc., the ancillary activity, allied activities, that pushed up agricultural growth. It turned out to be far better. The actual production number, the output-based number, GVA, turned out to be better. And remember, so this was a one-off because of all the election code, model code of conduct, etc. The government couldn't spend. There was election uncertainty, so private investment also took a hit. So everything turned out better than we had expected. So now that constraint is over, going forward into the next 3 quarters, I think it's eminently possible for the economy to hit a 7% plus growth.
At another level, India's economic growth at the end of the first quarter confirmed that it is steadily moving towards becoming a $5 trillion economy. Saugata, on that good note, I also wanted to flag a milestone, which is very important in India's journey towards becoming a 5 trillion economy. So I believe at the end of Q1, India is now a $4 trillion economy. So your thoughts?
No, so definitely it's a boost to confidence and sentiment. So actually, I would actually make it a little bit more ambitious, not a 5 trillion, a $7 trillion economy by 2030. The arithmetic is very simple. So, if you grow at about 6.5% over the next 7 years, and then you take about a 4.5% inflation, the GDP deflator, CPI, WPI inflation, and take about a 1% depreciation, which has been the historical norm. Going forward, you hit a nominal growth of 10% in dollar terms. You know that anything that grows at 10% doubles in 7 years. So from FY23's FY24, FY23's $3.5 trillion, you should be able to hit a $7 trillion economy in the next 7 years. And then that's the hard part, to sustain that kind of growth, like China did for some period of time. Over into the next 25 years, that's the challenge that economic policy needs to tackle and address.
Oh, very true. In fact, the next round of reforms will determine whether India can uh, avail of the power of compounding over a longer period. But that is a nice segue into our next segment, which is on pain points. So let's begin with inflation. Is the worst over?
Well, depends on the definition of inflation, which has become a hot topic of debate now. If you're talking about headline inflation, that probably is over. Fingers crossed, because I mean, in these climate uncertain times, you never can. It's never and never. So anything can potentially happen. But I mean, if things don't, I mean, if you're not in the extremes somewhere, if you're in the middle, then given the rains, given the ground moisture, given the levels of reservoirs, etc., I think the water problem for the next round of agriculture is probably more or less solved. So I think food inflation will probably see a decline in food inflation going forward. Even globally, the prices of edible oils, corn, etc., even that has stabilized, has not gone up too much. The fears of an El Nino, I mean, we are now in an El Nino condition, etc., La Nina condition, etc. So all of that, I think, indicates that food inflation is likely to taper from now. However, core inflation, which is currently hovering around 3%, which has been around 3% plus, just plus, over the last 3-4 months, that will now begin to tick up. Our forecast is, because this low level, there are multiple causes which I'll come to later, but one of the key reasons was that core inflation in FY24 had become very high. So the base effect of that high inflation has played out into the core inflation that we are seeing now. Uh, Over the next 6 or 7 months, till the end of FY25, we are probably likely to see a creep up of core inflation up to 4%. But there's a lot of things that we need to figure out. I mean, given this growth number, the aggregate demand that comes in with growth, and the potential effects on core inflation, that needs to be thought through in terms of the drivers of core inflation. The good news for core inflation is that global commodities prices, other than the electricity transition, renewables transition related metals, steel, aluminum, etc. So all of these, because of weak Chinese demand, other weakness in developed markets as well. So global metals prices are not that complex. It's not going to, probably, hopefully, fingers crossed, is not going to go up too much. Even oil, it seems that, which is another pain point, as you mentioned. So even oil demand, crude oil, is prices are expected to remain in a relatively contained range, unless the OPEC plus countries really cut back on output and production.
So, very clearly, your remarks are aligned with the RBI's sense of caution about inflation. They are not comfortable even now, though the core inflation, like you pointed out, is very low. So, what does this mean for an interest rate cut? Is it going to happen this fiscal, or we'll have to wait longer?
Look, my sense is, I think the balance of probability. Let's see what happens with the Federal Reserve. What happens with today's numbers. That is to say, Friday's numbers on the NFP data, the jobs data in the U.S. What kind of rate trajectory might we expect from the Federal Reserve? But given everything, I think, given the fact, given this, I think the balance of probability is for a 25, on the outside, a 50 basis point cut later on in this fiscal year, but probably 25. But the point is that, I mean, if we are growing, if RBI governor is correct, that we are growing at 7.2% for this year, where is actually the need for a cut? I mean, are we trying to increase our potential growth? Remember, that's another point. I mean, I forgot to mention in the core inflation numbers that we were talking about, that the RBI's monthly bulletin points out that India actually hit a positive output gap in the last quarter, in the January to March quarter of 2024. after a long period of negative growth with a slack in the economy, that output gap has now turned positive in the sense that actual output is more than potential output. That's a clear flag worry for the governor. In addition to that, there are all these worries about inflation expectations ratcheting up due to the saliency of high food inflation, etc. So all central banks are very wary of making policy mistakes. So if a rate cut, if it turns out to be premature and then food prices increase again, core inflation because of global demand, core inflation begins to increase, domestic demand increases, then that mistake that of cutting too soon, given that growth is still very relatively in global terms very high. So I think they're right to exercise caution these circumstances. Even despite all of this, I think there might be a need to give a leg up to increasing potential growth, potential output of the system, which might lead for a decision for a rate cut at some point in the future this fiscal year.
Now, moving to two other pain points which are critical if the growth rate has to be sustained is consumption and investment. On both, we are seeing a visible uptick, particularly in the Q1 data that has come through. What are your thoughts? Are both on the track of revival, or is this an aberration?
On the personal consumption side, my sense is again, I mean, we will not get into the K-shaped inequality imbalances, etc. The numbers that we have seen on wage growth, salaries, which is a proxy for urban consumption demand, private consumption demand, that's been very weak, tepid in the first quarter financial sector numbers of the listed companies. So that doesn't bode well. On the rural wage front, that's another worry. So till now, I mean, say by at the end of March of this year, the numbers that are there, rural wage growth also has not shown too much of a boost. Rural two-wheeler demand, which is another index that we all use to assess the strength of rural demand. So two-wheeler demand in the rural areas has actually come down a little bit. So urban wheeler demand has grown, but not rural demand. The commentaries that we are hearing from the FMCG companies, despite the expectation that this festival season is likely to be a strong demand period in the system. So I think overall, till the inflation levels come down a little bit, because this has really hurt, particularly rural demand, high rural inflation, and that's yet another reason for taking steps to curb food prices and other inflationary components. So till that comes down, disposable incomes will probably not increase to the extent that we can see a sustained increase in private consumption expenditure, either from the rural or from the urban side. Of course, I mean, whether that's a separate argument, etc., whether the monetary policy instrument is the proper tool, is the proper set of instruments to deal with food inflation, that's a separate debate altogether. But high food inflation actually cuts into discretionary incomes and keeps overall disposable income, I mean, discretionary expenditures down, which is a cause for concern, and which is the reason that I'm saying that I don't see a very significant increase in private consumption demand into the next 2-3 quarters at least.
Finally, what do you see looking ahead? That is India now attaining a new trend rate of growth, and is that trend rate of growth 7%?
So, of course, I mean, this is a really difficult question, a crystal ball which is totally shrouded now. I mean, given the various uncertainties that we are seeing, on a relatively superficial level, I think it's possible to sustain a growth rate of 6.5 to 7% at least for some time. Overall, I think the more appropriate question is what things need to change. What are the reforms? What key institutions? What governance? What actions? Ease of doing business? What are the things that need to change to take India to a 7% growth, to a 8% growth, 9% growth? What are these changes that might be needed? The first thing is, to my mind, of course, I mean, institutions, governance issues are bread and butter motherhood type statements. Obviously, those need to improve and remain at a high level relative to global standards. The key thing to my mind to ensure a 7% growth is reform at the state level, because this is where I think most of the reforms that we are talking about are likely to happen. Because I mean, the role of the center now in some of the basic input factors of production are now at the hands of the state. The center will play an enabling role, which it is doing very well. But overall, at the state level, at the Gram Panchayat level, at the municipal ward level, what are the things that need to be done to increase revenues, to make businesses, setting up businesses easier, to attract foreign investment, etc., which is what, remember, in the initial phases, that China had done excellently well. So I think that's the thing that will drive growth. The fact that Indian consumption is so completely underpenetrated in almost every segment that there is scope for increasing consumption demand. But that, obviously, I mean, one part is domestic savings, which has become a constraint. Another part is bank credit or credit from financial institutions, which is yet another, which again has become a source of concern now, given the fact that financial savings are not completely available at a lower cost of funds to the banking sector. So all of these factors, to my mind, another key critical issue is the role and enablement and empowerment of the MSME segment. Because remember, to sustain consumption demand, you need growth to be very broad-based. It's not concentrated in one decile or two deciles of the economy. And it is the MSME, the micro and the small segment, which is also the consumption pool. That it's not just the production set, but also the consumption pool. So the MSME segment, what kind of empowerment of the MSME segment is possible? How can credit to MSME segments be increased? So all of these factors, to my mind, will determine how long we can sustain a 7% growth, which is needed. I mean, because to do that, the compounding effect that you're talking about, you need a 7% growth over the next 20, 30 years. And these are the reforms that will determine what that new trend level of growth is likely to be.
So clearly, it will depend on how the government, the union government and the state governments nurse the bottom of the pyramid, to levels where they become serious economic stakeholders, right?
Absolutely, couldn't have put it better myself. I mean, so what you're saying is center-state coordination becomes a critical pivot, and around which a 7% growth story can sustain. And how this coordination can actually empower. So I mean, one part of, obviously, I mean, that I didn't talk about is skill sets. This will determine how India emerges as a manufacturing hub, going up the value chain in the services segments, etc. So center-state coordination on skill development it will be a critical part of this entire sustained growth story.
Saugata is not alone in his conclusions. Every commentator worth his or her salt is convinced about India's economic potential. However, there's a caveat. This is presaged on India's ability to push through the second generation of economic reforms. These are going to be politically very tough to achieve. To be sure, Prime Minister Narendra Modi sounded the bugle on economic reforms in his Independence Day address this year. The question is whether he can rally the political opposition to enable India to walk the talk on reforms. At the moment, the opposition is hell-bent on confrontation. But then, politics, they say, is the art of impossible. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNews Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.